Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're here to talk about whether or not games can equal profit and impact. And with me, I have my friends and colleagues, Susanna Pollack and Abby Spate, and we're going to talk to them in just a minute. But first, I want to provide a little bit of an overview. For those of you who were really excited to see Eric Huey of both ESA and a band, which is performing somewhere out there, he couldn't join the panel, so we're sorry about that misdirection. But we hopefully can cover your questions anyway. So I want to start just by talking a little bit about why we think this is an important question and why now is the time to really focus on it. I work at the Joan Ganz Cooney Center at Sesame Workshop, and the Joan Ganz Cooney Center was established about 8 years ago with the intent of trying to answer the 21st century equivalent of the question that Mrs. Cooney posed in the late 1960s, which led to her creating Sesame Street. She saw kids watching beer commercials and repeating what they heard, and she said if they can repeat beer commercials, they can repeat other things that they hear on TV. And maybe those other things would be meaningful in some way. And actually at the time, it was a real social movement for her because she was involved in the war on poverty. She was a documentary film producer at WNET in New York. And she saw it as a grand experiment of can television actually help not only to teach kids, but to try to bridge the divide that she saw happening among poor kids and not so poor kids, particularly in New York City. And so she went out and raised the money to create what she saw as a research effort that led to Sesame Street and led to the creation of what is now called Sesame Workshop. So I was able to talk to her just a couple of years ago when we first launched an effort at the Joan Ganz Cooney Center called Games and Learning, and ask her how she thought about games in the context of this trajectory that she witnessed for the past several decades. And what she says, well, I'll let her speak for herself because she's lovely and is much more interesting than I am. So here she is. This is Joan Ganz Cooney, who created Sesame Street and Sesame Workshop in the late 1960s. So I feel very privileged that I get to work in a space near her, with her sometimes. She's 85 years old, and she's still deeply committed to this idea. And for me, it's exciting to hear her talk about new technology and how it may help kids learn, but it's also interesting to hear her talk about, I think, research and development as part of a process that leads to both engagement and meaningful impact, right? And that's, I think, what we all want to talk about today. I should just clarify for those of you who may not be in this conversation 24/7 like some of us are. When we say impact, we mean impact both on an individual child and potentially on the world, right? And so as Susanna and Abby speak, they'll be speaking about both of those kinds of results. Mrs. Cooney is in particular talking about an impact on a child, and that could be cognitively, in terms of skills, it could be social emotionally, it could be creatively, it could be physically, right? We've seen evidence of games actually improving outcomes in kids who are cancer patients, for example, and so we would consider that impact. So why else do we think that this is, so we do think that we're poised to have this transformation occur in terms of how games and other forms of digital media could affect kids and youth. The other thing that's happened just in the past couple of years is interest has grown and expectations for games have really begun to shift. And why do we say that? We have software companies like Microsoft who are spending $2.5 billion on Minecraft. I think the White House just recently had its third education game jam. We have prominent journalists like Greg Toppo from USA Today, who just in the past year released his book, which is called The Game Believes in You. Susanna can speak more directly to Games for Change and the Games for Learning Summit, which brought together the Department of Education and ESA. We also see, in parallel to that, we see generational shifts that are making a difference in this conversation, right? So the easy way of describing that is that I grew up playing Carmen Sandiego. It's the most natural thing in the world to me. And I'm older than a lot of people that I work with. But I don't think twice about thinking of a game as a positive experience, right? And so increasingly, as a generation that grew up with that kind of experience, takes leadership roles and, they're working in Washington, D.C., they're becoming school superintendents, they're running investment firms, all these kinds of things, that generational shift is also having an effect on how we think about games. Then there's the money, which no one in this room, I'm sure, is concerned about in any way. But we know that spending on games and investment in ed tech in general on the rise. Actually, Europe and Asia are on par to outpace North America in the next couple of years. The work that I do, we look at this chart on the left-hand side where we see the global sales for games in 2014 was, nearly $82 billion. And learning games so far as just one part of Games for Impact is this tiny, tiny sliver of that, right? But when you compare that against the rise of ed tech, and the chart on the right, if you don't know of EdSurge, you should, because EdSurge does some really great work around this. It shows that while the number of deals is beginning to decrease, the amount of money that's invested in those deals is increasing. There's increasing interest and increasing traction in ed tech dollars. So as we see that market in K-12 schools, which does trickle into other spaces like after school and at home, is growing. The global games market is huge, but currently the sliver of that market that really has to do with games that are designed to teach kids or educate in some way is pretty small. That to us is a big opportunity. And then in terms of where I sit at the Cooney Center, which is part of Sesame Workshop, we know that there is a growing body of research that shows that playing great games can improve a child's life, right? And there's too many research studies to even cite at this moment, but it's a growing body of research. The benefits that I would point to most immediately would be there are high levels of built-in engagement. They are able to be personalized and customized. There's built-in assessment, which is a buzzword at the moment. They can be played alone, they can be played together, and they can also bridge formal and informal learning environments, right? So we're now, especially with the rise of mobile gaming, we know that you could play a game at school, you could play a game at home, you could even go to your, YMCA and play it there. And that type of effect is something really interesting for us to study. We also know from our research that parents and teachers are playing a big role in this transformation. This is actually a survey from Entertainment Software Association from last year where they asked the parents who cited playing games with their kids, they asked, why do you play games with your kids? I think it's funny that one of the biggest answers is just because they're asked to, because that's what parents do, because my kid told me to. But they also say that it's a good opportunity to socialize with their child, and they also say that they enjoy playing the games as much as their child does. And so that also represents a pretty significant shift. The Cooney Center did a survey, it's now been 2 years, I guess, on how how teachers use digital games in the classroom. And again, this number increased from when we ran the survey just 2 years prior. So 23% use games in the classroom 2 to 4 days per week, and 23% say about once per week. The number for every day is still only about 9%, but still 55% of those students in the classrooms of the teachers surveyed play games at least weekly, and that number is climbing. So with that, that hopefully provides you a little bit of context. I think what we may come back around to is what we had hoped the perspective that Eric would be able to share, which is the shift in distribution model. And so just to give you a little taste of that, and if there's interest for that, we can dive into it a little bit more. But we all know that the other shift that's occurring is the shift from games that are distributed as boxes on shelves to games that are mobile and social and very different distribution challenges and opportunities than we had even 10 years ago. But with that, I'm going to transition to Susanna, who's going to talk to you about her work at Games for Change.
And I will talk about distribution models as well, because I do think it's an important thing to mention as we talk about commercial games and games being distributed, that the development of platforms like Steam or even PS, even PlayStation Live or Xbox Live does allow the independent developer to release games independently without the big partners, and I think that has created opportunities too. But first, to talk a little bit about myself. So I'm Susanna Pollack. I'm president of Games for Change, and for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a 12-year-old not-for-profit And our mission is to harness the power of games that they can have beyond entertainment. And as Michelle said, it's the use of games in social impact space, humanitarian needs, and education. We house a festival ourselves called the Games to Change Festival every year in June. If you're interested, or in New York City in June, come check us out, where we celebrate the best games that are happening in this space. And what's interesting about the Games to Change sector is it's not only a community of game developers who are choosing to make games for these purposes, but it's also other kind of stakeholders and not-for-profit NGOs, government agencies, brands, foundations who all recognize the power that games can have to reach audiences and to impart information and change behavior. And so we bring all these stakeholders together to have a conversation and celebrate the power that games can have. But today I'm here to talk about the question of, can games equal impact, right? And
profit.
And profit.
Don't forget about the profit.
Yes, and the profit. So in the research that I've taken, and this is informal research, not in any kind of structured way, there aren't that many examples out there in the commercial sector that talks about games that have been developed from an impact perspective from the beginning. What I can talk about is some either happy accidents that have happened and some trends that are leading some of the AAA developers and platforms and publishers into that space. And I have two examples up here which I want to talk about, both of which have been made by Ubisoft. Assassin's Creed, I'm sure many of you have played. Anyone play Assassin's Creed? Played it? Okay. I see somebody here who looks at under the age of 18. But as that young man may attest to, as I can with my kids, that there's a whole generation of fans who are growing up learning about history through playing games like Assassin's Creed. The game has been developed up in Montreal with such integrity and with historians advising that not only are kids and young people playing the game and learning, but teachers are noticing. And through events that we've held at the Games for Learning Summit that Michelle mentioned, we've actually brought teachers together with the developers of that game together and talk about how mods can be created for use in the classroom. And although there hasn't been an official mod that's been done by Ubisoft, I can tell you that teachers are going in and trying to create versions of the game that can be used, that imparts the actual facts they're having within history, and perhaps leaving out some of the more controversial elements of a game that would be accepted in a classroom. Similarly, with Just Dance, again, a very populous game, obviously enjoyed by many families. It's hugely successful for Ubisoft. And they noticed an opportunity, initially through the marketing department, of creating and positioning Just Dance as part of this physical, education program of anti-obesity and getting kids out there and being active. And through a partnership with Michelle Obama, they partnered on the Let's Move campaign. And today, you've got thousands of kindergarten classes running Just Dance exercises because it's getting kids up and moving. And again, was that the intention of the game initially? No, I doubt it was. But it is a game that not only brings families together, it gets kids moving, and can be used for a purpose that will benefit and have the kind of widespread impact as well as individual impact that we're talking about. The next approach is impact through partnership. So I don't know if you noticed, a few months ago, there was an announcement that EA made about Madden, in partnership with the NFL, created a version of the game that focused in on statistics. Again, you've got millions of fans playing Madden, and as inadvertently dealing with numbers and statistics about having to make choices. Now, this isn't a fantasy football league. This is about understanding the mechanics of the game and understanding why certain strategies may work, and is layering in this mathematical curriculum. And so the three partners worked, or I guess two partners, EA and NFL, worked with Discovery Education to create a version of this game that can be distributed through schools. So from different example, let's say from Assassin's Creed and Just Dance, that predominantly has a direct-to-consumer model. In this one, they will they will market directly to schools. Albeit I don't believe this one has a monetary value assigned to it, so it's more for promotional purposes, but there is a chain of distribution that can happen through Discovery Education's established channels into the schools. The next example I wanted to talk about is impact through acquisition. So Michelle mentioned earlier that Microsoft acquired Minecraft 2 years ago for $2.5 billion. What you might not have heard is just a few months ago, they acquired a small version of the game that was created by a company called Teacher Gaming that was Microsoft EDU. And by acquiring that product, Minecraft EDU, by acquiring that product, they've been able to put into a strategy in place to distribute a version of Minecraft into the schools with a curriculum attached. Now, it's a little early to say whether or not this financial model is poised for success. They do have a pretty hefty price tag against it of $5 per student as a license fee. But with access to that game, those students will be able to play this version in school, at home, on their phones. So there is there's access to the game that can live outside of the schools as well. So I wanted to raise a couple of examples about games that were not published through a traditional AAA game developer, because I do think they're relevant. I think that the means of distribution now that are available to independent developers, as I said, through Steam or through Apple, through iOS, Android, does allow a revenue model to exist that perhaps didn't exist 10 years ago. And here are some examples. Now, albeit they're smaller in scale, we're not talking about 1.3 or $8 billion of revenue that Minecraft has, but for an individual developer or a small team, as you can see here, some examples, this is more than a good living. These are modest successes. So if you haven't played any of these games, they're really fun. Most of them are on a social impact kind of level as opposed to educational games. This War of Mine it takes place. It allows the player to take the role of a refugee and people who live in a community where they have a political army kind of taking over and having to live that experience. Papers, Please is about immigration. You step into the role of an immigration and passport agency, a passport portal, having to make decisions on who passes through. And Gone Home is more of a personal story, an exploration of self-discovery set in the context of kind of like a horror whodunit story. So all three, as I said, were made by small teams. They broke through on Steam or through I think the Apple Store. I think This War of Mine is available on Steam, right? And on the iOS Store. But this, to me, is a good example of you don't need to have those commercial models of the AAA developers. And if anything, I think the future holds a lot brighter for these type of games getting pushed out and finding ways to have impact and have that double bottom line where you can have make a living and break through and to have a success.
Thank you, Susanna. We'll come back to you with questions. Abby, do you want to talk a little bit about your perspective from Zynga?
Sure. That's a great transition, actually, because we are kind of in the exact opposite position as these indie game developers. So I'd say what their struggles are our strengths, and what their strengths are our struggles. So it's kind of interesting to put those two next to each other. But first, I'm Abby Spate. I'm the director of product for Zynga.org, which is the social impact arm at Zynga. Zynga is a social game company that makes Words with Friends and Farmville and Zynga Poker, which is downstairs, those types of games. And Zynga's mission is to connect the world through games. So there was always a really natural fit and opportunity to bring social impact into those games. And so my job is to work with Zynga teams, with Zynga employees, to figure out how we can use what we do well to drive social impact. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a few of the ways we do that and kind of where we see that going. The first is what we call social impact features. these are integrations in existing Zynga games that give players the opportunity to give back to a nonprofit, to raise awareness about an issue, basically to affect a social issue from within the game. What I love about this model is that it came about really naturally. It wasn't a decision by our CEO one day to start bringing social impact into our games. Rather, some product managers, some folks on studios looked at what our players really engaged with, looked at what they were excited about, and saw this opportunity to bring real causes into the games that our players were already playing. So the first charitable feature was a dog with a cape in Yeovil. Did anybody play Yeovil? Those who played Assassin's Creed? No, not the same audience. So it was a dog with a cape that benefited the San Francisco SPCA. And it was just kind of a scrappy grassroots feature that studio put together, but it was a huge success. And it flagged to Zynga employees that this could be a really great model that our players love, that can really benefit nonprofits, and that works well for the studios. So that model has built out throughout the years. Sweet Seeds for Haiti was a big breaking point for that model. This was a campaign in Farmville that we launched right after the earthquake in Haiti that ended up raising about $3.5 million for Haiti earthquake relief shortly thereafter. So it was really a proof point that if you make it really easy and compelling and bring together players who are already engaged in these games, who are already passionate, who are already connected, there's a real opportunity to turn that into social impact quickly. So this is an example. This is a more recent example from Farmville 2 Country Escape, where we had an entire event in the game that was all around, again, the ASPCA, raising awareness about adoption and raising funds for that organization as well. So we see an opportunity to meet players where they are, where they're already going every day, where they're already feeling comfortable, where they're looking for interesting, engaging content, and using that as a really great platform to connect them to causes that are doing, or to organizations that are doing important work. So then next, so I mentioned the Sweet Seeds for Haiti campaign. Another important part of our in-game charitable features is disaster response. So when there's a natural disaster, we definitely see a swelling of support from our players in game, and we want to meet that, and we want to give them an opportunity to give back through the games that they're already playing. So this is an example from about a year ago when there was the earthquake in Nepal. Words with Friends ran a feature where they set a goal for players to play to score a certain number of points within a given week, and if they reached that goal, we would make a donation on their behalf to a responding organization, Direct Relief. So we have found that as we continue to work with game studios, our players actually come to expect these features if there's a natural disaster. I remember talking to some players about how they felt about charitable features in their games, and they said, when they open up their game and there's something going on in the world, they expect a way to connect to that from within the game. And so that it's really important for us to kind of bridge the real world and the virtual world and give people an easy and effective way to give back through our games. So that's an example of that. If you go to the next slide, so there's also a category of that kind of bridging between the real world and the virtual world that's not about raising money, it's not about raising awareness, but it's about giving our players space to connect and process and share support when there's something tragic that happens in the world. And so this is after the Sandy Hook shootings. We heard from a lot of our players, we're used to seeing these disaster response features in your games. We want to do something. How can we help? How can we help? We talked to local community organizations in the town. There wasn't a strong ask for funds. So we decided what we were hearing from players was that they just wanted to connect. They wanted to reach out. They wanted to share their support. So through our games, we gave players a way to send a message of support, just kind of submit it to the community, and then a team of Zynga employees volunteered to build this microsite that surfaced up all of the comments from our players around the world in these lanterns that were floating up into the sky. And so we sent that over to the local schools, to the local community partners. They made it available to the community there in Sandy Hook. So to me, this was just a beautiful way to create space for players to connect and to offer support when that's what they really were looking for. So those are our in-game efforts. Another way that we think about social impact through games is through mentorship opportunities. So I'm going to talk about 2 programs that leverage Zynga employees as mentors. This is CoLab. CoLab is a learning games accelerator that Zynga.org runs in partnership with some local organizations. We just kicked off our 5th cohort of companies. So we currently have 5 ed tech companies that are coming into Zynga every day and getting access to great talks, to great mentoring from Zynga employees and to each other as these valuable resources. So the idea here is that when you're just getting started, one of the most valuable resources you can get is just some advice and some experience from somebody who's been there. So through CoLab, we match Zynga employees with ed tech companies that are looking for specific types of expertise or feedback. So we go through a 1-week boot camp where all of the CoLab cohort companies hear from experts at Zynga on growth and distribution, or on applied analytics, or on UI, UX, and art. And they get kind of the high-level overview of how does Zynga think about building a successful game. And then they actually sit down with those fellows and talk about their struggles, their successes, where they think the opportunities are. So by the end of that week, we have a really strong profile of each company and an idea of how Zynga mentors can help them while they're there at Zynga. And so then for about 3 or 4 months after that, each company works with Zynga mentors to try to address one of the challenges that they see in their game. So this is kind of a way for Zynga to support the ed tech industry and try to help these smaller, early stage ed tech companies get over the hump, address a challenge that they're facing, just move more quickly because we really believe in that space and we want to support the entrepreneurs that are working in it. And then last but not least is what we call internally Studio G. G stands for good. And so it's a studio of volunteer Zynga employees who are working on games with partners externally. Our first game was actually with Games for Change. It was Half the Sky. It was a game around the Half the Sky movement, around women's empowerment issues globally. You get to see a nodding head. That's awesome. Right now, we're working with Adam Ghazali, who's a researcher at UCSF. His focus is all around how games can have a measurable cognitive impact. So how can games change your neurological structures? How can games actually make you better at remembering what you're trying to remember, focusing on what you're trying to focus on? And he runs them through rigorous research trials. So he is not... his claims are real. He is measuring this. He is making sure that these games are truly effective. So he's a neuroscientist. He's a researcher. He creates these kind of prototype games or hypotheses. And then we work in partnership with him to try to make those as fun, as engaging, and as beautiful as possible. So it's a great division of responsibility or partnership in that he can really focus on what works from a neurological standpoint, hand it off to our volunteer employees to add some elements of progression that really make someone want to keep coming back and play, or adds really beautiful UI to make it easy to use and fun to use. So we've finished 2 games in partnership with him. We're working on the 3rd now. And his work is really interesting from a distribution perspective because his vision is that games can actually be prescribed in the place of medication. So imagine that you have ADHD and you've been taking medication to address that. His theory is that his games can address something like ADHD just as well as a medication would. And he's seen some really great results around applied or directed attention, meaning the ability to pay attention to what you're trying to pay attention to. So the first game that we worked on in partnership with him is going through those clinical trials. He has a game going through FDA approval right now. So when thinking about what are new and upcoming distribution channels for games, maybe prescriptions.
Maybe.
Adam Ghazali. Yes. It's a spelling bee now. Gazzaley. UCSF. Sorry?
Adam, yes, Adam.
Oh, I thought you said Adam Gazzaley. Yes.
Okay, great, thank you.
Sure.
And there's actually a lot of the great information that Abby is sharing. We have in a case study around Zynga.org that's available on gamesandlearning.org. So if you go to gamesandlearning.org, you'll also see the links that take you to Adam's work.
Yeah.
Yeah, the funny thing about the FDA approval is that that's how I felt when I heard that Remission 2, which is a fairly well-known game, that's the one I was referring to, that actually has shown that kids who have cancer and they play this game, their outcomes are better. And the idea behind it is that it gives you this first-person perspective on traveling through the body and how does cancer work and what are the things that you need to do to battle it. But it's not just about practically, eating right and exercising. It's also about empowerment, kind of understanding how your body works and really taking ownership over it. And it has been shown to have these great outcomes. Cigna, the health insurance company, is now distributing it.
I didn't know that.
Because they believe it will help their business to distribute that game.
Yeah, the game does, what they measured too was the commitment that these young cancer patients had to taking their medicine. So it was about self-administering their medicine, the pills, after they have treatment in hospital, and that has increased.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. It's called Remission 2. There was a Remission 1. This is the sequel.
There's also kind of in that sphere our biofeedback games, and you can probably speak to this better than I can. But the idea is that if the game can surface to you an increased heart rate or increased stress reactions of some kind, you can actually learn to decrease those, and that helps you. That leads to a lot of positive outcomes in terms of your ability to succeed in stressful situations. And Aaron Reynolds has a really
there's
great
a game called Nevermind that does just that. It actually encourages you to calm your heart rate down, and the more calm you are and lowering your pulse through the game, and it's basically a horror game, the better you do to advance through the game.
It's really fun. You should check it out.
Fail that game.
But I think Nevermind. The challenge, though, with that, I'm not quite sure about the clinical trials, is how do you measure, whether they are truly measuring the success in the same way that Dr. Gazzaley is,
right,
in terms of some clinical research. But still, it's, they don't profess to be anything than an entertainment game that might have some benefits in lowering your heart rate.
Yeah.
So you guys are talking about a lot about how video games are helping people get healthy or like different ways, like even going through the FDA. But what do you think about like the adverse effects of like video game addiction or internet addiction?
I think we all have something to say about that. So first of all, games are a medium like everything else, right? So it's a tool. And so from my perspective at the Cooney Center, we would say they're neither good nor bad, right? It just depends on how they're used and who is supporting the use, right? So especially when it comes to very young children, it's important that the parents and the educators in their lives are a part of those decisions in terms of how they're being used. But they're neither good nor bad any more than television is, neither good nor bad. In terms of the research, there's actually a study we just posted on gamesandlearning.org just in the last week that there was a fairly new study that was actually showing that it was a trial of youth who were playing video games, and at the end of the trial, they were actually better at social interaction than they were before, which is not what some of the older research studies were showing. So I think just in terms of the social aspect of it, and to your point, kind of the effect of playing a lot of games, and that question about isolation, we've seen that those studies have evolved with some of these other, maybe it could be the quality of the games, it can also be the way that the games are used in what settings, but the outcomes are actually better than they were before, right? We're actually seeing that there is no negative effect, and in some cases it's a positive effect. That said, there are games that are really great and games that aren't, right? Just like TV, or movies or anything else, right? And so I think part of what we're talking about, and I know that both of you have something to say about this subject too, part of what we're talking about is that there is a way to be deliberate and to be thoughtful about the way these things are built. that leads to the kinds of outcomes that we're talking about, right?
Just to piggyback on that, one of the trends we're seeing with CoLab with the ed tech companies are these physical and digital partnership games. So games that have both a digital component and a physical component. And what that really enables and builds upon real life interaction while a child is playing a game. So there's a lot of thought, especially in ed tech, being put towards how do you unlock collaboration, how do you unlock real interaction, even if there's a digital component to the product. And I think there's some great examples of that.
Just briefly, and it's my personal opinion. I don't have any research to back this, but I think it's all about moderation, and that's what Michelle says. It's just as any form of entertainment. It's about how you use it, how often you use it, and what you're consuming. So I think that there are games that are best to be taken in moderation, and that there are games, as Michelle and Abby's talked about, that are deliberately made for a social impact or some kind of positive outcome, and that is what we're focusing on.
Right. Thanks for the question.
Are there you mentioned games that have a physical component? Are you talking about games that have physical pieces that you play in sort of a small area, or things like geocaching?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think both of those apply. I was talking about the former. So, so games that might have, like, In Play is one of the companies in the latest cohort for CoLab, and they have products that are, a stuffed animal or a cauldron or some physical object that you have in front of you, but then your quest line, your sort of progressive element is brought to you through the digital experience on your tablet, and then those two things can be brought together through augmented reality and through those types of technologies where you're sort of experiencing the physical through the digital. But it enables you to be playing in a real way with someone who's in the room with you and collaborating that way.
We're working on an app that's sort of the ultimate social change app, because it could make it a lot easier and faster to recruit not only 1 million people willing to do door-to-door work to get the constitutional amendment, get rid of our corrupt campaign finance system, these kind of laws that we need to do urgently, but another 1 million people willing to get arrested when to do direct action. Because you put those two strategies together, that's what's led to the most positive social changes in our history. And one worry I have is sometimes with Bernie Sanders people, I'm a Bernie volunteer, and that's why don't you be using rewards more? And so if you went to 50 households, you get a symbolic reward. If you went to 100, maybe somebody in the neighborhood would take you out for dinner, or a plumber would give you an hour's worth of free plumbing, or psychotherapist would give you a free time, whatever. And if you went to 200, you get wine and dine by the whole neighborhood. And he said, well, they're reluctant because you then kind of erase the intrinsic motivation and intrinsic reward that keeps most of us. We're doing it to save the planet. We're doing it because it's the right thing to do, because we know protesting and inequality is savage. And if we start basing it on social rewards, once those end, people stop being activists. What are your thoughts about there? Any research you know?
Well, I think what you're describing, you guys can jump in if you think I'm wrong, but I think what you're describing is actually the question of gamification. So there is research around gamification. And so what gamification does is it takes something that is not inherently a game, it's not built as a game, and then puts a level of rewards on top of it, right? And there's actually quite a lot of commentary, at least, about gamification. There are concerns about it, because to your point, when something is built as a game from the ground up, it has those intrinsic rewards, right? And it has that kind of depth of psychological connection and meaning that you don't get just by layering a reward on top. That's what we would call the chocolate-covered broccoli syndrome, right? I think, though, what you're asking it's slightly different in that it makes me think, so I've worked in nonprofits for a very long time, and We studied, at one of my older jobs, we studied the first Barack Obama campaign and what they did in terms of the online dashboard. So if you were a supporter of that campaign, you had this dashboard, right? And it actually tracked for you all the different ways that you participated in the campaign. And it included knocking on doors and making phone calls. And there were not the kind of rewards you're describing, like a free massage or dinner or whatever it was, but it was more like a leaderboard. And it did allow, it was symbolic, right? And there are studies, there actually, there's a lot of work done on what worked and didn't work about his online campaign. And some of the people who worked on that spun off and created their own firm called Blue State Digital. This is someone off the topic, sorry, I just happened to know. But they started a firm called Blue State Digital. Oh, yeah?
Which I'm from.
Oh, very good. Well, there you go. See, you can speak to this. Yeah, they want you to use the microphones. So you could speak to it directly, but I think what you're talking about is a little bit of a hybrid between the question of gamification and then the question of how you use some of these techniques in terms of online activism, more in like a moveon.org kind of way. And so it might be kind of a hybrid of those two things. Do you think? They really want you to use the microphone. Yeah. We'll take this.
I think specifically about the Bernie Sanders campaign, they're already using the same playbook very effectively in terms of the maximizing digital engagement and motivating the crowd through the same tool set that was used in the Obama campaign. I don't know if they're specifically using the dashboard to motivate people, but all of the other tools are ones that they're using.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The question of gamification actually may be driven by some of this discussion as well, right? Because they see success, they see engagement. So the question is, if you layer these things on top, does it improve sales, downloads, right?
And just from an anecdotal perspective, we think about the intrinsic versus extrinsic rewards a lot because there is there's this existing intrinsic desire that we see in our players to give back, to have a positive social impact, and we don't want to replace that with just granting them a digital good. And we do think about that a lot. And I think a couple ways that we've been able to weave that into a game and still make it feel authentic is through group goals. So when the whole game community is working together to achieve a goal, and when that goal is met, everybody receives some sort of reward, that ends up feeling like a promise achieved or like an intrinsic motivation, satisfied. And then the other example is when we give players a way to kind of rally their community or their friends to come into the game and help them support the cause. And so we see that there are ways to use the game as a platform for players to kind of advocate internally or to be a part of some success that has real meaning that ties back to the intrinsic desire in a more authentic way.
I have two questions. First is, what is your biggest ROI? Is it creating new games or partnering with companies that have already made games? And then my second question is, are you working in the VR space at all? Because it's considered the empathy machine.
So ROI and VR, I think that's directed at you.
Me?
first.
Okay. So our biggest opportunity is engaging our existing player base. That's kind of the value that we are lucky to have. So the biggest ROI that we see, for us, it's not typically about creating new games. It's about creating experiences in our existing games that make it really easy and effective for players to give back through that game. VR, we, in partnership with Adam Ghazali and UCSF, we're working on a game for Oculus, which is really exciting. It's all about directed external attention, so your ability to pay attention to what you want to pay attention to and ignore what you want to ignore. That's a picture of someone with a brain monitoring cap on. But the idea in the game is that you are in a bathysphere, in a deep sea environment, and you're collecting bioluminescence from fish. And you get less and less information about when and where and how those fish are going to appear. And your goal is to be able to respond as well, as quickly, as accurately with less and less information. So that by the end of the day, if I'm looking at this room and something unexpected happens, I'm able to react well just as well as if you told me something unexpected is going to happen right there in 10 seconds. So that is the type of experience that is really conducive to VR. I think you mentioned empathy, not for empathy, although I think that's really interesting, but more because of its real life applications that have to do with being in real space.
But Susanna, you're also focused on VR in terms of the showcase for Games for Change, right?
Yeah, so we're looking at new technologies in general and new immersive platforms that are offering new pathways for impact. So we actually have an event in April as part of the Tribeca Film Festival where we're highlighting these kind of hardware and software as well. So there are VR installations, there's biofeedback, the game Nevermind that I talked about is going to be there. You get to have your biofeedback and your heart rate monitor attached. We have wearables is another. So I think just as we talked about, these are just additional tools that can be used for different types of impact. Some are social, some are individual, some are for learning, some are for empathy, but all of that is very exciting, I think.
Thanks for your question.
Thank you.
Next question.
Morning, everyone. Verdell Walker, Harvard Business School. Thank you for coming out to speak to us today. I had kind of a multi-part question about using games for education, and I just kind of want to take it back to the example of Assassin's Creed, which is not what you would think of something that is educational, but it actually does have a very large historical component to the game. Mm-hmm. So I was really wondering if you had any best practices for how developers can engage educational professionals within the game development process and also designing games that can ultimately be used not just for pleasure, but also for teaching students. And then lastly, just your thoughts around kind of the best ways to monetize that. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for that question.
Yes, very good question.
And I'm sure others on this panel will have an opinion too. Well, all these questions are exactly what we're addressing at something called the Games for Learning Summit that we started last year with the U.S. Department of Education. And the whole purpose of that event was to bring together educators, academics, game developers, ed tech, developers together to talk about how this collaboration can happen, because it needs to happen early. You can't layer in a curriculum and a video game afterwards, and it's just not going to have the kind of effective nature. And you can also be difficult to assess too. We talked a little bit about assessment and how that's inherent in the way the games are built, that teachers are able to, if it's set up properly, to see how students are progressing through a game. And you can see when there are moments where students aren't able to master, right, a subject area. These games are structured around failing, and where failure is actually a good thing. You keep failing until you learn, and then you master and move on. For all these reasons, it's an amazing opportunity for educators and game developers to partner. So if you are interested, I do recommend attending more of these events. Games for Learning Summit is not the only event that brings together this community. There's GLS, there's
Games Learning in Society in Madison, Wisconsin.
Yes, there are a number, and if you want to get in touch with me, I'll happily give you a card. I'll give you a list of these time of events. But the collaboration is really key. It's about marrying a content expert with the game developer expert and having these partnerships, gestate from the very beginning. And I think that with Assassin's Creed, they did that from the very beginning. They just didn't do it for the purpose of an educational product in the end. They did it because they wanted to have a product that resonated, that was accurate, that had integrity. And for all those reasons, and the fact that it looks gorgeous and has great game mechanics, they just happened to nail a lot of the right components to make a successful game. What they didn't build into it is any opportunity for assessment. They didn't develop a distribution strategy to get into schools. Now, if they had done all of that, and that is what I would love to see some of the bigger developers do, and it's possible that can achieve those goals. In terms of what is the return, in terms of how do you monetize, some of that has to be focused on what is your end consumer. Are you looking to sell this through schools? And you've got the book publishers who are now figuring out how to make digital products. They're looking at different content that can be pushed through to schools. Then there's also a direct-to-consumer model where you are trying to sell these products directly to parents or to the students themselves. So I think there are viable different models. You kind of have to decide early on who you want to market towards, and then go it from there.
thank you for the question.
It seems like you've mostly talked about companies that have either been making games that have a discovered educational aspect, educational technology companies that are branching into educational games, and specifically research-oriented groups normally affiliated with schools. And I was wondering if there was a space in monetized or not educational games for change for indie developers who don't necessarily have one of those backgrounds to go build specifically for Games for Change, and if so, what resources were available to them, and if not, should they just package an educational and interesting experience in a normal game?
No, I mean, I think absolutely there
It's
is
a great
space.
question.
There's absolutely space for that. And those three examples that I put up, I don't know if you can find it,
Yeah,
those
sure.
three developers absolutely were making games for change. And they're all independent, and none of them are educational. So most of those were creator-driven. So they're driven by the artists, you know, the game developers having a story they want to tell. And because they're very creator-driven, and these stories happen to be meaningful and personal and wanting to have kind of impact. None of these were designed with, like, as I said earlier, with an assessment tool. Like, there's a question of, you know, how do you measure impact? None of these game developers would say, oh, well, there's a model and we did this clinical study and blah, blah, blah. The impact is, you know, is just about how many people are playing it and the fact that there's a positive message that hopefully connecting. I do think there's a place for this kind of studio, and I can give other examples of studios that have grown out of a lot of game developer universities, a lot of students coming out of it, a lot of the artistic community. There's a whole movement called expressive games, which again is more about telling personal stories and explore gender and explore racial issues as opposed to, you know, bombings in Iraq, you know. So there are a lot of different, I think, modalities of games. And to develop that community, you're welcome to join our community. We have a very active Google group, and there are 4 active developers or would-be developers who are starting out and are looking to develop that kind of community.
I will say, based on my personal experience, that community is very collegial and very supportive of each other. So I wouldn't pack it in. Whatever you said at the end there, should they just pack it in? Yeah, I wouldn't pack it in. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
One
Yeah,
more
thank
thing
you.
I'm going to say, just because, thank you, Abby, for reminding me. Well, we put out several times a year some challenges out to the developer community to design games around a social issue. These are calls to action for developers, possibly like yourself, who are looking for funding, looking for commissions. And we typically do that on behalf of a partner or a sponsor, a fiscal sponsor, and a not-for-profit. So we actually have 3 active right now. They are overlapping. One is on financial literacy, one is about climate change, and the other one is on diversity. And all you have to do is go to gamesforchange.org, and if you look at the blog, they'll list out the criteria for each. And sometimes these challenges require that the participant has to have a functioning studio to actually make the game. And sometimes these challenges are just a surface of great ideas. So if you want to come up with a paper concept and it's a kick-ass paper, you know, concept around, you know, climate change, that's enough to win, just depending on what the guidelines are. So great opportunities for exposure that way too.
I'll check that out. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, I think we have time for one more. Go ahead.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Hello. Thank you for coming out and doing the panel. My question was sort of like with Assassin's Creed, it was always designed with the intention of being historically accurate, but it was never designed with the intention of teaching children about history or teaching anyone about history. And there's a game a dear friend of mine and I play, and we love it, we think it's so fun, is called Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes. It's a 2-player game where one player is presented with an explosive device and one person is presented with a manual. And so the 2 players have to communicate by saying, okay, this thing has like 4 red wires here, which wire do I cut? And the person with the manual
I've
says...
played it, it's really fun.
Yeah, and the
Really fun.
person
I
with
like
the
the
manual
title.
says, cut this wire or don't cut this wire. And so I was thinking Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes could be used to teach people about communication skills, even though it was never designed for this. So how do you feel about, like with Assassin's Creed and Keep Talking, how do you feel about games that were never designed to be impactful or educational ending up doing those things?
I think that's a happy accident. You know, I almost made my slide called "Happy Accidents," but it's a byproduct, right? It wasn't intentional, but often that by the integrity of and the inspiration of the game developer, you end up with something that really affects people. I mean, I'm all for it, and I think and I think so are teachers. I think as this generation, we talk about the generational shift, as teachers that have grown up playing games are realizing that they need all the tools they can use in the classroom, and they don't care where they're getting it from. And if they come across a game like that and they think it's going to help their students collaborate and communicate in advance of their next, their next joint history project or mock debate or whatever it might be, that they'll use that in the classroom. So I don't know if you play it or you know the developer, but I think it's the type of game that absolutely should be brought to the attention of academics at one of these many conferences that I've talked about, because I think it'll be used.
Well, it also goes, I mean, I think what's kind of interesting about that is this top-down versus bottom-up type acceptance of these things, because Minecraft, I think, is the ultimate example of that bottom-up kind of adoption, where it wasn't something that came with a huge curriculum and a huge package that was sold to schools, and you had to convince teachers you should use Minecraft in the classroom. Kids were playing it at home, and there were a handful of teachers that found out about it, one named Joel Levin in particular, who started his own company. He was a computer science teacher in Brooklyn, and he saw Minecraft and said, I think I could mod something out of this. I think I could do something with it with my kids in my computer science class. And he created a whole community around that. And that led to a company called Minecraft EDU, which was then purchased by Microsoft. And I saw Joel last week, and he's no longer a Brooklyn computer science teacher. It's been quite a trajectory for Joel. But it actually kind of illuminates a way around what most people see as a big barrier in this space, which is it's so hard to sell into schools, it's so hard to convince superintendents. But when you have something like these games that aren't packaged that way, it's sort of a back door, right? It's more of this grassroots kind of acceptance and adaptation of it, right? Which may end up being more successful than going the other way.
Yeah, and I think two other enablers for that are just there's a focus on 21st century skills, things like collaboration that you wouldn't necessarily have been deemed just purely educational in the past, but now there's a growing acceptance of the educational value of those sorts of skills, and those are the skills that are nurtured and fostered through a lot of non-intentionally educational games. And then a theme at Games for Change conference a lot of the time is that learning is actually fun naturally if you don't get it in its way. You're progressing, you're achieving. These are all things that feel good, and so a lot of the things that we choose to do because they're fun have some inherently educational or learning value. And so if you kind of get out of its way, or you create a way for teachers to use that tool quickly and easily and measure its effectiveness, it can happen naturally.
Yeah. Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, real quick. Besides that app that's going to be recruiting 1 million people to get arrested and 1 million people to do door-to-door, the main thing we're working on is an app that helps couples have better relationships.
Oh.
And I've had a very hard time, since we don't have a pile of money, to recruit people that are everybody from storyboarders to game designers and developers to gamify that, or actually have a companion game. I own Coupleville, by the way, give you a little hint, to go along with the company's called Couple Wise, which is right now just very learning-oriented, teaching skills to couples that they need to succeed. My question is, can you give me any smart ways to recruit game talent that willing to work for a little bit plus stock, because they're so hard to find. Usually they're very young and don't care about marriage anyway. But maybe older game talent.
So just quickly to answer it, I think probably going to students and going to graduate level students is my suggestion.
What would be the best school for that?
Yeah, well, so there's actually an alliance that ESA supports. So if you go to the Entertainment Software Association website, you'll find information about the Higher Ed Video Game Alliance.
Yeah, it's called HEVGA, HEVGA, Higher Educational Video Game Alliance. You can just Google it and you'll find it. And it's a network of 141, I think, schools. And they must have some communication out to different schools.
Yeah, there's schools with game design or game development courses.
Okay, what about
okay, thank-
Zynga alumni? Any way of getting a hold of them? You guys laid off a lot of people at once, so I'll talk to you later about that.
So thanks so much for coming. We really appreciate it, and we'll be here for a few minutes if you want to come up and talk to us. Thanks so much.